Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be tuning in from. Jason Buffington and I want to welcome you to episode 33 of our Industry Insights program. Well, welcome, Jason. This is really a second part in a four-part or all January series of what I'll call a fairly amazing amount of data. I was thinking about this over the weekend. You and I were both industry analysts. I don't think that I ever had access to this kind of data the 13 years I was at a pretty major analyst firm. So it's exciting to be able to unpack this and share this with everyone. Before I turn it over to Jason, just want to give a shout out. If you have any questions, comments, please feel free to enter that into the LinkedIn comment section. And of course, give a shout out to where you're tuning in from. We'll reference that a couple times throughout. We've got this world map. I'm in Colorado. Jason's in Texas. Our producer's in Georgia, and one of our co-production assistants is over in Europe, as you can see. But we'll see if we can't get a little more of the globe turning green as well. So without further ado, Jason, we've got some, I'll call them hard facts and figures. Hard because it's almost like hard, cold stone truth or reality. But maybe you could kind of unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, we think this is arguably the largest single data set of research, unbiased research done by a research company, beyond anything that I saw ever when I was an analyst like you, or from any other vendor in the data protection space. The survey company did 3,000 unbiased enterprises around the world. 28 countries. I mean, it's a huge amount of data. Now, let's be clear, and to not disparage all of our friends in the analyst community, you typically don't need 3,000 data points in order to statistically defend a position. The reason we did, though, was because at Veeam, we want to make sure not that you have 300 as a global data set, but that you have 300 in the US and 300 in the UK and 300. I mean, you can see how those numbers start to pile up over time. So anyway, so yes, it's a massive data set. And so over the course of January, we want to share in four parts some of the data we found. So we started off last week looking at what were the early effects of COVID and how we should be thinking about that for IT strategy going into 2021. This week, we're going to look more specifically at let's call it the problem statement, right? So if we could bring up the first slide, and this is something that Veeam has focused on this question for quite a while. We used to call it the availability gap, but that's actually on the top. The protection gap, that's on the bottom. I think of it as a reality gap. And so if you here's some homework for the kids at home. If you put the business leaders in one room and you ask them, if IT were to go down, how long would it really take before IT services would start or ask me, if IT goes down, how long can you afford to be without those services before the business processes start to suffer? That's conference room number one. Then walk down the hall to conference room number two, put the IT folks in that room and say, hey, when the stuff breaks, how long would it really take to get back up and running again? And that's the problem, right? So is there a gap there? And when 2,800, in this case, a few hundred folks were filtered out of this particular question, when 2,800 enterprise IT decision makers were asked this question, 80%, that's the top line, 80% either agree or strongly agree that their organization has a gap between how fast they can recover the applications and how fast their users need that. That's the availability gap. 4 out of 5 institutions have this problem, right? The bottom, same respondents, 76%, so 3 out of 4 organizations, said their organizations have a gap between how frequently the data gets protected and how much data they can afford to lose. Here's kind of the punchline of this. If you're working the math on the back of a napkin or the back of an envelope, think about this. For most organizations, if the only thing you're doing is nightly backup, whether that's to disk, to tape, to cloud, whatever you're doing, but if you're only doing something every night, then let's presume that maybe the server goes down first thing in the morning, you lost nearly nothing. Maybe it goes down at the end of the day, you lost a whole day worth of data. So split the difference and presume you will always, all bad things happen at noon, you will always lose a half a day of data. Well, if you go to the business unit owners and say, how do you feel about losing a half a day of data? Right? According to this, 3 out of 4 organizations would say that is not okay. right? So that is what we call a protection gap, meaning that the expectations of losing data is intolerable compared to nightly backup or every couple hours or whatever that happens to be. 3 out of 4 have a problem with protection. 4 out of 5 have a problem with availability. That's the landscape that we're looking at for this year.
Yeah, and to really put a finer point on that, Jason, I mean, the first part makes sense. It's going to take longer than you would like, than the business would like, maybe than what you've signed up and agreed to in terms of a service level. But let's really be clear about that second stat. That's how much data you're likely to lose. And you always have to think about things like that in basically the worst case scenario, right?
Right.
The bottom there, 23%, approaching 3 out of 4 say, I'm going to lose more data than what I've agreed to from the business perspective. Really quickly, let's do a shout out onto the map. We've got, I believe, Cleveland. Congratulations to Cleveland for winning a professional football game for the first time. I think it's in 22 years.
Oh,
We've got
God.
Germany, Saudi Arabia, Algeria, Kansas City, very much also alive in the number 1 seed if you follow American football. Malaysia, Washington, D.C. Good effort, though, Washington, D.C. Poland, Hungary, France, Phoenix, Arizona, Mexico, and the United Arab Emirates. So we're getting an amazing amount of central color there, but great new additions there. A couple names are countries that we haven't seen before, Jason. So that's pretty exciting. Let's hit our next slide or statistic if we could, please, because this is pretty interesting. Now, I'll kind of warn everyone, we're going to get a little nerdy here, and not to make it sort of an algebraic equation. However, if you're in the business of availability, you're an engineer at heart. I love the title, Jason, because it kind of says it all. Why is backup still a big deal? Well, it's because things aren't quite as we would like them to be, are they?
No, they're not, right? So, it seems like such a passé topic. And you and I have both been in the backup business for over 30 years each, right? And so you would think, why can't we solve this? Right. And I think there's 2 major reasons, right? One, so the main reason is that the production environment keeps evolving. And as that does, it creates a lag that legacy backup solutions can't keep up. I think that's one of the problems. And the rest, let's just attribute to poor administration, architecture issues with the applications. There's lots of reasons why backups fail. But so when this year, when that research company went and asked those folks, they asked, in the past year, approximately what percentage of your backup jobs completed without errors and within their backup window? And those are both core aspects of the backup admin's job, or IT ops, or whoever's job that is. And the bottom line is 63%. Right. So roughly 2 out of 3 or 3 out of 5, depending on how you want to split that math over. But that's a pretty sad percentage, right? Go to your boss and say, hey, that job you pay me for, I'm going to get it right 3 out of 5 times. Hope you're good with that. Right. How is that okay?
Yeah, well, and the reason why I think it's especially concerning is it's because as an industry or as an availability practice, we're collectively throwing so much resource, meaning, human administrative effort, capital in terms of the infrastructure that we use for protection, obviously software licenses. It's not like we're not trying to address this problem, and yet here we find ourselves still having a real issue with backup. And of course, it almost feeds into our next statistic, Jason. It's a bad joke, but you can't restore that which you haven't backed up. So if you already have an issue with backup, that means even if restores are 100% successful, you are going to have some issues. However, unfortunately, restores aren't 100% successful, are they?
No, they're not. So if we look at the second of the major statistics that we had in this, along with the backup question, we also asked a similar question on restores. So I think that's going to be slide number 3, if we can pop that up. And it's the same question, right? So in the past year, what percentage of restore jobs were successful in restoring data and within expected time? And as you mentioned, certainly you can't restore what you didn't back up successfully. And I would also make the point that that unfortunately what we see a lot of times is that the backup software said everything worked fine. And really what you ought to be looking at is the backup software. Really what it said was the tape drive didn't complain. The storage did not say it was full. right? The fact that it didn't flag an error does not necessarily mean that you have restorable data. Our esteemed colleague Michael Cade actually does a fantastic series on his blog on Veezilla, specifically looking at what we call sure backup and the verification ability of that. But just without the Veeam speak, 66%. So again, right at 2 out of 3 recoveries were able to complete successfully, and again within their RPO or RTO expectations. And speaking of RPO, that we actually do have a question from Keith that came in during the chat. So Keith asked, how does Veeam compare with Zerto on recovery point objective? Zerto is in second. So Zerto started off as a DRAS exclusive offer, and so their plumbing is meant to be replication centric. We've done replication and backup and snapshotting for years. One of the only areas that we didn't have equitability was around that continuous nature of data protection, or what many folks call CDP. That's actually in V11. And in fact, if you saw Anton Gostov, who's our SVP for R&D, he did a post on the Veeam forums over the weekend. We are so close. He outlined all the requirements for that, but we are eminently delivering V11. It has CDP in it. Myself, I'd rather have replication and snapshotting and backup over just the replication aspect, but this does give us parity in that aspect. So thanks for the question, and please keep the questions coming along the way. All right, so we've talked about backup, right? Roughly 3 out of 5. We talked about recovery, 2 out of 3. There's one more stat, right?
Yep. Yeah, let's look at the server side, meaning are bad things going to happen to one of your servers? And the punchline is, unfortunately, yes. Now, the good news is it's a lower percentage than what we've seen. The bad news is that percentage is still very high, meaning, let's round up, 1 out of 4 servers are going to have an unexpected error. And, the problem associated with this distribution, as you can see, is in some cases, that's the average, 1 out of 4 roughly. But look at that spike, Jason. 36% report that greater than 1 in 4 to almost 1 in 2 have an error. I mean, that is a high degree of failure in this day and age.
Yeah, it's kind of a bummer. And admittedly, I'm going to put my purist research analyst hat on. The reason this question was framed this way was because we assumed that the average server outage rate was going to be in single digits, low teens, et cetera. So we put granular options in for the research company up through 25. We thought, surely it's not going to be that high. Right. And so there was a single band for 26 to 50, another band for more than 50. So when we do this research next year, probably going to be even bigger then. But when we do that, we should probably add the granular bands all the way up, because this extrapolated average, looking at that spike, you're likely even higher than the 23% if you just run the math. It's just no way to do that with this data. But man, that's tough. 1 out of 4 servers has at least one unexpected outage per year. Right. So, OK, now you said, Dave, that we weren't going to get into algebra. I'm going to get into algebra. Let's go ahead and take a look at how the math actually turns out for this. Let's go to that last slide for this for this little section. So take a look at the bottom of this. So we said earlier, so 63% organization said that 2 out of 3 backups are going to be successful. We talked about how you can't restore, which didn't back up. So multiply that times 66, and you get in the lower right-hand corner, and this is tough to say. Wait, hold on. Go back to the algebra. 42%. 42, that's 63 times 66. You do your own math. Go to your logs, and you can do this yourself at home. You're going to be able to recover what you thought was protected just under half of the time. And then think about, if 1 out of 4 servers is going to go bad, the pessimist in me says that means you should write off data from 1 out of 8. Right?
That's right.
Cover half. So so this is tough. This is why we're still talking about backup in 2021.
Yeah, and just keeping this sort of algebraic equation up for a moment, or considering that in your mind, if 1 out of 4 is average, but almost best case scenario, because we saw that the highest concentration of server failure at 36% was between 26 and 50% of your servers.
Yeah.
So that 23% up at the top, that's on average, but the highest band is even higher, meaning even more servers, could be half, are going to experience this self-reported. This isn't Jason's opinion, my opinion, Veeam's opinion even. This is several thousand global people responding that, yes, 63% of the time the backup's successful, 66% of the time the restore works, and oh, by the way, on average, 1 out of 4 servers are going to go down. Jason, no one wants to be a betting person when it comes to, matters of engineering, but literally you're worse than a coin flip probability here, if you look at the bottom point. And for those that might be thinking, I just have a hard time accepting these numbers. Well, we're with you. Jason and I had a hard time accepting these numbers too, but yet this is what people are self-reporting. And part of the reason why, if we look at our last slide, is that, Jason, bad things still happen in the data center, meaning there aren't just one issue or set of issues we have to worry about. In the middle, you can see cyber. I'll let you kind of parse through this graph and what the different bars are. But the quick takeaway is many things threaten server availability and uptime.
Yeah. So one last data point, and this is actually one to take a screenshot on and do some homework and look on your own boxes for this. But what you see here, so the long dark green lines here are check all the things that affected you last year. Hey, by the way, there was a question from Mark we should talk about here. Are we talking about physical versus virtual? We're talking about servers. Right. So the actual instructions to the respondent was physical servers or virtualized machines. And I think what Mark is getting at is, oh, by the way, if you lost a physical host, in fact, the instructions in the survey actually said not including hosts of virtualized environments. So if you lost a physical host, you didn't lose one server, you lost all the VMs that were on it at the same time. Right. So this survey question actually told them to exclude those and just talk about production serving workloads, physical or virtualized. And so with that as the definition of server hardware was a big deal. Infrastructure was number 2. And then look at this. So we got some soft ones. Application software, storage hardware is the number 4. And we see that start to work down. So those are all the ones that apply. And to your point, there's a myriad reasons. I'm actually just as interested looking at the gray lines. That was the most impactful. They can only choose one. Most impactful in 2019 was OS software, right? Let's see, number 2 was storage hardware, and number 3 was server hardware. Okay, the reason I think that's interesting is because as you lean into, say, cloud-hosted infrastructure, people seem to believe that if you go to a hyperscale cloud, all of a sudden everything is just natively durable, magically like a silver bullet, it's just going to keep on working. And that's actually not true. Number 1 cause, most impactful in 2019, was OS issues. The OSs inside those cloud-hosted VMs is still your OSs. That's still your problem. Right. By the way, most impactful in 2020 was cyber by like half a percentage point. And then right behind that was infrastructure. And one of the things we covered in infrastructure a few weeks ago was if you haven't tried standing up a VM in a cloud hosted infrastructure, it's kind of complicated. So there are some issues there. I know we're coming up on time. Let me offer a piece of homework for folks, because we've offered a lot of data on this particular thing. The best thing that you can do in your environment is go check your own logs, right? Go to your own backup software and take a look, and you will find that failures happen along that way. And then what is the real answer for you? Go to your restore jobs and look at that. If you have a ticketing system, this gets even easier. But when you start to look through those numbers, go look at your server logs if you have a monitoring tool and find out how often are my servers burping, right? So this is unbiased data that frankly was surprising to us.
Yeah.
Even more surprising is probably going to be if you go and look at your own stuff. My guess is you're not far off.
Yeah, and as we start to bring up the map and wind up, I think, Jason, your point is look at real data, right? Yeah. And so we always say it's important to test your restores. I think it's also important to understand what does your outage pattern look like? And recent history is oftentimes a good forward-facing predictor. But it's worth examining, and we really were a bit surprised at this, unpleasantly surprised, frankly. But this is why we still see so many organizations saying they're looking to modernize or improve their availability practices. So let's take a look really quickly at the map before we wind down. I think there's a few more countries in there. In fact, a lot of South America.
There you go.
Colombia, Brazil, Argentina, one of your favorites, Jason.
South America in the house. All right.
Well represented. In the U.S., Indiana. We also have Dubai in as well. So nice makeup here. I will tell you, everyone that's watching or viewing live, we tend to probably get 3 to 5 times as many people in a full week after we record this that do view it. So if you do have comments or questions, please continue to put them in there and continue to put a shout out where you might be tuning in from.
That's some good representation across Europe. Grateful for that.
Indeed.
And EMEA and India was in the house. Very good. Yeah, thank you for everyone who's joining this week. And yes, please feel free to keep telling us where you're coming from. And if you have more questions and comments, we had some great ones from Keith and from Mark and from Matt through the thing. Keep asking those. Dave and I will try to get to those even after the live stream is over.
Yeah, absolutely. As we begin to wind down and look ahead, we're going to have a couple more readouts based upon this research. Jason, why don't you tee up what we're going to talk about 1 week from today, which is a continuation of what we just began.
Yeah, so if last week was around, finishing 2020 and COVID, this week is around the problem statement, right? And by the way, I would also tell you that it's possible your numbers aren't as great, but for the 2,800 enterprise or 3,000 enterprises that responded to this is a perception as much as a reality. Most of these respondents didn't go look at their logs. They said, this is what I think it is. And unfortunately, in IT, perception actually trumps reality more often than not. So that's the problem statement. In week 3, next Monday, we're going to start talking about more of the solutions. We're going to start looking at what did those organizations say they were looking for in order to solve these problems. And then part 4, you can't have a conversation about IT modernization and digital transformation without talking about the cloud. And so we're going to look at some of the futures and present mode of how folks are using the cloud as part of their data protection strategy. And that's going to wrap up the 4-part series.
Outstanding. Well, thank you again for everyone tuned in. Ask questions. Please keep those questions coming. Until next Monday, thank you, everyone. Stay safe, stay positive, and we'll see you next week. Bye for now.
Bye.